To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. David Crane had built his life like he built his construction empire, one calculated move at a time. At 45, he commanded respect from concrete suppliers to city planners. His calloused hands had shaped half the commercial buildings in Phoenix. But those same hands had been gentle when they first touched Rebecca 22 years ago. Rebecca Miller had been the college journalism major who interviewed him for the university paper about student entrepreneurs. Fresh-faced and ambitious, she'd asked sharp questions about his small contracting business. He was 23, already employing 6 guys, and completely smitten by her quick wit and infectious laugh. "You're going to own this city someday," she'd said, notebook forgotten as they talked until the coffee shop closed. She was right. Crane Construction had grown into a $50 million operation. David owned 17 properties across 3 states, employed over 200 people, and had connections that ran deeper than most politicians. But success had a price, and somewhere between the late nights reviewing blueprints and the early mornings on job sites, Rebecca had grown distant. Their son Tyler, now 21, had inherited Rebecca's quick tongue and David's stubborn streak. The kid was graduating from Arizona State with a business degree, paid for by David's relentless work ethic. Tyler had always been closer to his mother, especially after David missed too many soccer games and school plays chasing contracts. What David didn't know was that for the past 8 months, Rebecca had been sharing more than coffee with Brad Hoffman, her editor at the Phoenix Herald, where she'd finally landed her dream job 3 years ago. Brad was everything David wasn't: smooth, intellectual, and available. He wrote poetry and discussed literature, while David calculated load-bearing requirements and negotiated with suppliers. The Tuesday that would change everything started like any other. David was reviewing plans for a new hotel complex when his phone buzzed with a Venmo request that made his blood freeze. Chapter 2. The Betrayal Unfolds. The Venmo notification lit up David's phone screen like a slap. $3,400 for our son's graduation party. Pay fast. The message sender was Rebecca, but the tone was foreign. In 22 years of marriage, she'd never demanded money like this, especially not through a payment app. David set down his coffee and called her directly. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice sharp and impatient. "Did you get my request?" she asked without preamble. "Rebecca, what's going on? Since when do you?" "Just pay it, David. Tyler's graduation is this weekend, and I've already committed to the venue." Something in her tone raised every instinct he'd developed in 2 decades of business negotiations. "What venue? We never discussed a party. We don't discuss much of anything anymore." Her voice carried a bitterness he'd never heard before. "You're always buried in work. Some of us actually care about our son's achievements." The accusation stung because it held truth. David had been working 18-hour days on the hotel project, trying to secure the biggest contract of his career. But $3,400 for a graduation party seemed excessive, especially without consultation. "I'll transfer the money, but I want to discuss the details first. Where's the party? How many people?" Rebecca's laugh was cold. "Don't be delusional, David. You're not invited." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What did you say?" "You heard me. This party is for people who actually matter to Tyler. People who've been present in his life." David's grip tightened on the phone. 21 years of supporting his son, of working himself to exhaustion to provide opportunities Tyler took for granted. And now he was being excluded from celebrating the boy's graduation? "Rebecca, I'm his father. I paid for his education, his car, his—" "You threw money at problems, David. That's what you do. Well, here's another problem money can solve. Pay for the party you're not welcome at." Before he could respond, she continued with words that would echo in his mind for weeks. "My boyfriend will take your place anyway. Tyler likes him better." The line went dead. David stared at the phone, the word boyfriend reverberating through his consciousness. In the span of 30 seconds, his marriage and relationship with his son had been revealed as elaborate facades. The woman he'd worked himself nearly to death to provide for had been building a new life without him. And apparently, their son was complicit. His phone buzzed again. Tyler was calling. Chapter 3. The Ultimatum. "Dad." Tyler's voice carried none of the warmth David remembered from their last conversation, 2 weeks ago. Tyler, what's going on? Your mother just... Look, Dad, I need you to just pay for the party, okay? Mom's stressed enough without you making this difficult. David felt the betrayal deepen. His son's tone was dismissive, almost annoyed, as if David was an obstacle rather than the man who'd sacrificed everything to give Tyler opportunities. Son, I just want to understand what's happening. Your mother mentioned a boyfriend. Brad's cool, Dad. He actually shows up for things. He came to my last 3 games when you were too busy. The casual way Tyler mentioned this other man, the acceptance in his voice, revealed how long this deception had been building. David's absence at those games had been to secure the hotel contract that would fund Tyler's future, but that irony seemed lost on everyone. Tyler, I've worked every day for 21 years to provide for you. I think I deserve some consideration. You deserve consideration? Tyler's voice hardened, sounding unervingly like his mother. When's the last time you asked about my major? My girlfriend? My plans after graduation? You just assume throwing money at everything makes you a good father. Each word was a calculated strike. David realized this conversation had been rehearsed, planned. They'd discussed how to handle him, how to extract what they needed while discarding what they didn't want. Tyler, I love you. Whatever's happening between your mother and me, that doesn't change. If you loved me, you'd pay for my graduation party without making it about you. Tyler's voice took on an ultimatum edge that David recognized from business negotiations. Mom needs the money by midnight. If you don't pay, we're all blocking you. Forever. The threat hung in the air. David's construction empire meant nothing if his family turned their backs on him. But the demand itself, pay for a party you're excluded from, funded by your labor, to celebrate achievements made possible by your sacrifice, represented a level of disrespect he'd never tolerated in business. Tyler, let me ask you something. In all your business classes, did they teach you what happens when you try to extort someone who holds all the cards? Dad, don't be dramatic. You want to block me? Go ahead. I'll block you first. David ended the call and immediately began dialing another number. If his family wanted to play hardball, they'd learn why David Crane had never lost a negotiation that mattered. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Crane, you old bastard. What can I do for you? Detective Ray Morrison had been David's friend since high school, before either of them knew what they'd become. While David built buildings, Ray had built a career in investigations, eventually running his own private firm after retiring from Phoenix PD. Ray, I need a favor. A big one. How big? David looked at the Venmo request still glowing on his phone, at the wedding photo on his desk where Rebecca smiled like she meant it, at the blueprint for the hotel that had cost him his family. The kind that changes everything. Chapter 4, The Investigation. Ray Morrison's office occupied the 3rd floor of a building David had constructed 5 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either man as David sat across from his old friend, explaining the situation that had unraveled his life in a single afternoon. 22 years, Ray. 22 years of marriage, and I find out about a boyfriend through my son's casual conversation. Ray poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle he kept for occasions that demanded it. How long do you think it's been going on? Tyler mentioned Brad attending his games. That's at least 3 months, probably longer. David accepted the glass, but didn't drink. His mind was already working through calculations, timelines, missed signals. I need to know everything. How they met, how long it's been happening, what they've been planning. Planning. Ray, this wasn't spontaneous. The graduation party exclusion, Tyler's rehearsed speech, the boyfriend comment. They've been preparing for this moment. They wanted me to find out this way. Ray opened his laptop and pulled up several screens. I'll start with social media, phone records, credit card statements. You said she works at the Phoenix Herald? 3 years now. That's probably where she met him. David finally took a sip of bourbon, the burn focusing his thoughts. But I need more than evidence of an affair. I need leverage. What kind of leverage? David's expression hardened. The kind that makes them understand who they're really dealing with. Over the next 6 hours, Ray's investigation revealed a betrayal more calculated than David had imagined. Rebecca and Brad Hoffman had been planning their future together for months, including detailed discussions about divorce settlements and custody arrangements. Text messages revealed their amusement at David's obliviousness, their confidence that his work obsession made him an easy target. But the revelation that cut deepest came from Tyler's social media posts. For months, He'd been referring to Brad as basically my stepdad and sharing photos of activities they'd done together, activities David had missed due to work commitments. The posts painted David as an absent, money-focused father while elevating Brad as the engaged, caring male figure. They've been building a narrative, Ray explained, showing David the timeline. Rebecca's been documenting your absences. Tyler's been creating social proof of your disconnection, and they've been establishing Brad as the replacement. The graduation party demand wasn't about money, David realized. It was about establishing a pattern. I pay for things I'm excluded from, accepting my role as a financial contributor rather than a family member. Ray nodded. And if you'd paid without questioning, it would have set the precedent for the divorce proceedings. You're the absent workaholic who throws money at problems while the real parenting happens without you. David stood and walked to the window, looking down at the construction site across the street where his crew was working late to meet a deadline. These were men who respected him, who depended on him, who understood the value of his dedication. His family had seen that same dedication as abandonment. What about Brad Hoffman? Ray pulled up another screen. 38, divorced, 2 kids he sees every other weekend. Works as a senior editor, makes decent money, but nothing close to your league. No major debts, no criminal record, but... Ray paused, scrolling through additional information. But what? He's done this before. His ex-wife filed a restraining order 3 years ago, claiming he'd alienated her children against her during their divorce. The case was dropped, but the pattern's there. David turned back to his friend. He targets married women and turns their families against them. Looks like it. Rebecca might think she's in control, but Brad's following a playbook. The information crystallized David's understanding. He wasn't just dealing with an affair. He was up against a predator who specialized in destroying families. Rebecca and Tyler were victims as much as they were betrayers, but that didn't change the fact that they'd chosen to exclude and humiliate him. Ray, I need you to dig deeper into Brad Hoffman. I want to know everything, his finances, his habits, his weaknesses, and I need it fast. How fast? David checked his watch. It was approaching midnight, the deadline for the party payment. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Rebecca and Tyler, but he'd kept it on silent. I have a feeling tomorrow morning is going to be very interesting for everyone involved. Chapter 5, The Power Play. David's phone exploded at 6:47 a.m. with the fury of people who'd finally realized they'd miscalculated. 91 missed calls, 63 text messages, and 17 voicemails painted a picture of panic that satisfied something dark in David's chest. He listened to the voicemails while reviewing Ray's overnight research. Rebecca's voice progressed from angry demands to desperate pleading. Tyler's messages evolved from entitled outrage to confused worry. But it was the final voicemail from Brad Hoffman himself that told David everything he needed to know. David, this is Brad. I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Rebecca and Tyler are really upset, and maybe we should all sit down and talk like adults. I'm sure we can work something out. The conciliatory tone was interesting. Brad Hoffman was feeling pressure, which meant Ray's preliminary investigation had already yielded something useful. David's assistant knocked and entered his office. Angela Torres had worked for him for 8 years, managing everything from scheduling to confidential communications. She'd seen him navigate hostile takeovers and city council battles, but the cold focus in his eyes this morning was something new. Mr. Crane, your wife has called 6 times. She says it's an emergency. No emergencies today, Angela. Hold all my calls except from Ray Morrison. David handed her a sealed envelope. But I need you to deliver this personally to Rebecca at the Phoenix Herald. Make sure Brad Hoffman is there when she opens it. Angela took the envelope without questions. She'd learned that when David Crane moved with this kind of precision, it was best to simply execute orders and stay out of the way. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with an address and a time. Desert Palms Restaurant, 2 p.m. Come alone, or don't come at all. By noon, Ray had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Brad Hoffman that revealed the true scope of his manipulation. The man was a serial family destroyer with a pattern spanning 15 years. He targeted successful, unhappy wives, isolated them from their support systems, and gradually turned their children against their fathers. After the divorces, he'd move on to the next target, leaving broken families in his wake. He's not just an affair partner, Ray explained as they drove to Desert Palms. He's a psychological predator. Look at this pattern. He always chooses women whose husbands are successful but absent. He provides emotional attention while gradually undermining the marriage through the children. David reviewed the files for previous relationships, for destroyed families, forefathers who'd lost everything to a man who specialized in exploiting their dedication to providing for their loved ones. What's his endgame with Rebecca? Based on the financial records, I'd say about 18 months. That's his pattern. Long enough to secure maximum alimony and property settlements, short enough to move on before the novelty wears off. They arrived at Desert Palms, an upscale restaurant David had chosen for its private dining rooms and discreet atmosphere. Rebecca sat alone at a corner table, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. She looked older than her 43 years, stress having carved lines around her eyes that David hadn't noticed during their increasingly rare interactions. "Where's Brad?" David asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I told him to stay home. This is between us." "No, Rebecca. Nothing is just between us anymore." David placed Ray's dossier on the table. "The man you're planning your future with has done this 4 times before. You and Tyler are just his latest marks." Rebecca glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but..." "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm telling you facts." David opened the folder and spread out photographs, court documents, and financial records. Brad Hoffman targets successful men's wives. He turns their children against them. He destroys families for profit. For the first time since the conversation began, Rebecca looked uncertain. Her eyes scanned the documents, taking in the pattern of destruction Brad had left behind. "You're lying. You hired someone to fabricate this. Call his ex-wife, Janet Morrison. She's expecting your call." David slid a phone number across the table. "Ask her about the restraining order. Ask her about how Brad convinced her kids that their father was the enemy." Rebecca stared at the number, but didn't reach for her phone. "Even if this is true, it doesn't change anything between us, David. You chose work over family." "You're right. I did choose work. I chose to build something that would last, something that would give our son opportunities you and I never had. I chose to sacrifice time so Tyler could have everything." David's voice remained calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "And you chose to destroy that sacrifice for a man who sees you as a temporary convenience." The truth of his words was written across Rebecca's face. Deep down, she'd known something was wrong with how easily Brad had entered their lives, how perfectly he'd provided everything David couldn't. But admitting that meant confronting the magnitude of her betrayal. "What do you want, David? I want you to understand that the game you started has rules you don't know. And I've been playing by those rules a lot longer than you have." Chapter 6. The Revelation. Rebecca's hands shook as she finally dialed Janet Morrison's number. David sat silently, watching his wife of 22 years confront the reality of her situation. The call connected, and Rebecca's face grew paler with each passing minute. "Janet? This is Rebecca Crane. I need to ask you about Brad Hoffman." David couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Rebecca's expressions told the story. Shock, then denial, then growing horror as the pattern Ray had documented was confirmed by someone who'd lived through it. "Your children, they won't speak to you?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "He convinced them that, oh my God." The call lasted 23 minutes. When Rebecca finally hung up, she looked like she'd aged a decade. Janet Morrison had described exactly what was happening to Tyler: the gradual alienation, the reframing of David's work ethic as abandonment, the subtle poisoning of a child's relationship with his father. "He's been planning this from the beginning," Rebecca said, more to herself than to David. "The things he said about you, about how Tyler deserved better, he knew exactly what to say. Because he said it before. For times." David gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. "You're not his first victim, Rebecca. You're just his most successful target. Tyler doesn't know. He thinks Brad genuinely cares about him. Tyler is 21 years old. He's an adult who made adult choices about excluding his father from his graduation." David's voice carried no forgiveness. "He chose to threaten me, to cut me off, to replace me with a stranger. Those were his decisions." Rebecca looked up, tears in her eyes. "David, we can fix this. I'll tell Tyler the truth about Brad. We can work through this." The hope in her voice was painful to hear. She still didn't understand the fundamental shift that had occurred. David had built his life on trust and loyalty, and both had been shattered in ways that couldn't be repaired. "Rebecca, You've been sleeping with another man for 8 months. You've been planning a life without me. You excluded me from our son's graduation and demanded I pay for the privilege of being replaced. David stood to leave. There is no working through this. But if Tyler finds out about Brad, Tyler will learn the truth about a lot of things. But that doesn't change what he said to me, what he chose. David paused at the table. I don't forgive betrayal, Rebecca. I never have. Ask anyone who's tried to cheat me in business. As David walked away, Rebecca called after him. What are you going to do? He turned back one final time. I'm going to teach everyone involved what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. That evening, David returned to his empty house, a 4,200 square foot monument to 22 years of marriage that now felt like a museum of someone else's life. Rebecca had been staying at Brad's apartment for the past week, though she'd been careful to maintain the fiction of their marriage for public consumption. Ray Morrison arrived at 8 o'clock with additional intelligence that confirmed David's suspicions. Brad Hoffman wasn't just a serial family destroyer. He was also deeply in debt, gambling away his income at underground poker games and private casinos. His pursuit of Rebecca hadn't been entirely emotional. He'd been counting on divorce settlements to solve his financial problems. He owes $47,000 to some very unforgiving people, Ray explained. His credit cards are maxed, his apartment lease is behind, and he's been borrowing against his Herald salary. Rebecca represents his financial salvation. How long before his creditors get impatient? Based on the threatening calls he's been receiving, I'd say he's already past the patience point. He needs Rebecca's divorce settlement to come through fast. David smiled for the first time in days. Then let's make sure he gets exactly what he deserves. The next phase of David's plan would require precision timing and the kind of ruthless calculation that had built his empire. Brad Hoffman had made the mistake of targeting a man who understood that real power came not from manipulation, but from control over the systems that governed people's lives. By morning, Brad Hoffman would learn the difference between playing games and playing with someone who owned the board. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. David's alarm sounded at 5:30 a.m., but he'd been awake for hours, finalizing the details of what would be Brad Hoffman's worst day. The beauty of his plan lay in its simplicity. He wouldn't need to fabricate evidence or manipulate facts. He would simply ensure that Brad's existing debts and deceptions came to light in the most devastating way possible. At 7:45 a.m., David made the first call to Frank Carlisle, owner of the underground poker room where Brad had accumulated most of his debt. Frank was a businessman who appreciated direct communication and prompt payment. He was also someone who'd borrowed money from David's private lending operation 5 years ago. Frank, it's David Crane. I hear you have a customer who's been avoiding his obligations. Brad Hoffman, son of a bitch, owes me 47 grand and thinks pretty words are payment. Frank's voice carried the edge of a man who'd exhausted his patience. You know something about this? I know he's planning to come into money soon through a divorce settlement. I also know that plan just fell apart. David provided Frank with Brad's work address and schedule. Might be worth having a conversation with him today. The second call went to Marcus Webb, editor-in-chief of the Phoenix Herald. Marcus had been trying to get an exclusive interview with David about the hotel project for months. Now David was ready to trade. Marcus, I'll give you the hotel exclusive, but I need a favor first. I understand you have an employee named Brad Hoffman. Brad's one of our senior editors. 1. Check his expense reports for the last 6 months. Cross-reference them with his actual whereabouts. I think you'll find some interesting discrepancies. David paused for effect. And Marcus? You might want to look into his gambling debts. Employees with financial problems have a tendency to find creative solutions. The third call was the most important. Detective Lisa Chong of the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit had worked with David on several construction fraud cases. She owed him favors, and David was calling them in. Lisa, I need you to look into Brad Hoffman's finances. I have reason to believe he's been embezzling from the Phoenix Herald to cover gambling debts. What kind of reason? David provided the evidence Ray had compiled, credit card statements, bank records, and documented instances where Brad's reported work activities didn't match his actual locations. It painted a picture of someone using company resources for personal problems. I'll look into it, but David, this better be solid. I can't afford to chase shadows. It's solid. And Lisa? Time is important here. He's planning to flee the state soon. By 10:30 a.m., All the pieces were in motion. David's final preparation was personal. He drove to Tyler's apartment near the ASU campus. His son's car was in the parking lot, and David knew Tyler would be home, nursing a hangover from the graduation party that had proceeded without David's funding. Tyler answered the door looking exactly as David expected, disheveled, defensive, and surprised to see his father. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I came to give you a graduation present." David handed Tyler an envelope. "Open it." Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a single sheet of paper with a list of every sacrifice David had made over 21 years. Missed vacations to fund Tyler's activities, 16-hour workdays to pay for his education, declined opportunities to attend his games and events. "Tyler, this is the cost of being your father. $50,000 represents about 2% of what I've invested in your future. Consider it your inheritance." Tyler stared at the check, confusion replacing his hangover. "Dad, I don't understand. You chose to exclude me from your graduation. You threatened to cut me off unless I paid for a party I wasn't invited to. You've accepted another man as a father figure while treating me like an ATM." David's voice remained calm, but his eyes were stone. "You're an adult now. Adults live with their choices." "But Mom said Brad was just." "Your mother lied. About Brad, about me, about everything. But that doesn't change what you said to me, what you chose." David turned to leave. "Use the money wisely. It's the last you'll get from me." As David drove away, his phone buzzed with the first update. Frank Carlisle had arrived at the Phoenix Herald with 2 associates, demanding immediate payment from Brad Hoffman. The scene in the newsroom had been dramatic enough to draw management attention. The trap was closing exactly as David had planned. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. By noon, Brad Hoffman's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. David monitored the destruction from his office, receiving updates from Ray Morrison, who had positioned himself strategically to observe the fallout. The first blow came when Frank Carlisle confronted Brad in the Herald's newsroom. Security cameras captured the entire encounter, Brad's face draining of color as Frank calmly explained the consequences of unpaid gambling debts. The scene caused enough disruption that Marcus Webb was forced to investigate, leading him directly to the expense report discrepancies David had highlighted. "Brad's been using company credit cards for personal expenses," Ray reported. "Hotel rooms on nights he reported working late, restaurant charges during supposed business meetings, cash advances that don't match any legitimate company business." The second blow arrived when Detective Chong showed up with a warrant to examine Brad's financial records. The gambling debts, combined with the misuse of company funds, created a compelling case for embezzlement. Brad's attempts to explain the situation only made things worse. His story changed with each question, revealing the depth of his deception. Rebecca arrived at the Herald building just as Brad was being escorted out in handcuffs. She'd been completely unaware of his financial problems, having seen only the charming facade he'd presented during their affair. The reality of dating a criminal facing multiple felony charges shattered her romantic fantasies in an instant. "She's in shock," Ray observed, watching Rebecca from across the street. Whatever she thought she was getting into, this wasn't it. David felt no satisfaction watching his wife's dreams crumble. The betrayal had been personal, but the consequences were simply business. Brad Hoffman had made the mistake of targeting someone who understood power at a systemic level, someone who could orchestrate destruction without getting his hands dirty. Tyler arrived at the Herald building 30 minutes later, having heard about Brad's arrest from friends who followed news feeds. David watched from his office window as his son emerged from his car, confusion and panic evident in his posture. The young man who'd threatened to cut off his father was discovering that his replacement father figure was a criminal. David's phone rang. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. "David, please. We need to talk. I think you're a little busy right now. Brad's been arrested. They're saying he embezzled money, that he has gambling debts." Rebecca's voice cracked. "I didn't know any of this." "Of course you didn't. You were too busy planning your new life to investigate the man you were planning it with." David's tone remained neutral. "How's Tyler handling the news?" "He's devastated. He looked up to Brad, trusted him." Rebecca paused, the implications finally sinking in. "David, did you do this?" "I didn't make Brad Hoffman gamble away his income. I didn't make him steal from his employer. I didn't make him lie to you and our son." David watched Tyler pace frantically outside the Herald building. I simply ensured that his existing problems came to light. You orchestrated this. I protected myself from people who tried to extort and replace me. The fact that those people chose to align themselves with a criminal was their decision, not mine. Rebecca was crying now, the full scope of her miscalculation becoming clear. She'd thrown away a 22-year marriage for a man who'd seen her as a solution to his gambling debts. She'd allowed that man to poison her son's relationship with his father. And now she was facing the consequences of choices she couldn't undo. David, please. Tyler didn't know about Brad's problems. He's just a kid who. Tyler is 21 years old. He threatened to cut me off unless I paid for a party I was excluded from. He chose another man over his father. David's voice hardened. Age doesn't excuse betrayal, Rebecca. Tyler made adult choices, and he'll live with adult consequences. The call ended with Rebecca's sobs echoing in David's ear. But the sound brought him no pleasure. This wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing boundaries that should never have been crossed. As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of Brad's deceptions emerged. The man Rebecca thought she loved had targeted her specifically, researching her marriage and identifying her vulnerabilities. He'd manipulated Tyler with calculated precision, using the boy's natural resentment about his father's absences to serve his own agenda. The revelation that their relationship had been entirely fabricated added another layer of devastation to Rebecca's situation. She hadn't just lost her marriage. She'd lost her marriage for a lie. David received one final call that day, this time from Tyler. Dad, I need to apologize. I didn't know about Brad. I thought he genuinely cared about me. Tyler, the problem isn't what you didn't know about Brad. The problem is what you chose to do to me. David's voice carried no warmth. You threatened to cut me off unless I paid for your party. You excluded me from your graduation. You replaced me with a stranger. Those were your decisions, made before you knew the truth about Brad. But I was manipulated. He made me think you didn't care about me. And you chose to believe him instead of trusting 21 years of evidence to the contrary. David looked out his office window at the city he'd helped build. I don't forgive betrayal, Tyler. I never have. The line went quiet for a long moment before Tyler spoke again. So that's it. You're cutting me off forever. I'm accepting the relationship you chose when you threatened to block me forever. David's voice remained steady. You wanted to know what happens when you push someone too far. Now you know. Chapter 9. The New Foundation. 6 months later, David Crane stood in his new office on the 42nd floor of the hotel he'd built. The project had been completed on time and under budget, establishing Crane Construction as the premier commercial builder in the Southwest. The success had opened doors to opportunities in California and Texas, expansion plans that would require his full attention. Rebecca had filed for divorce 3 weeks after Brad's arrest, but the proceedings had been complicated by her association with a criminal. The prenuptial agreement David had insisted on 22 years ago protected most of his assets, limiting her settlement to what the law required. She'd found work at a smaller newspaper in Tucson, starting over at 43 with a tarnished reputation and limited prospects. Tyler had attempted contact 17 times over the 6 months, his messages evolving from angry demands to desperate apologies. David had read every message but responded to none. The young man had graduated without ceremony, his celebration tainted by the knowledge that his father's money had funded his education while he'd chosen another man as his role model. Brad Hoffman had been convicted on 3 counts of embezzlement and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. His gambling debts remained unpaid, ensuring that his release would bring new challenges. The men he owed money to were patient but unforgiving, traits David understood and respected. On this particular morning, Angela Torres knocked on David's office door with a familiar expression, the careful neutrality she wore when delivering news about his former family. Mr. Crane, Tyler is in the lobby. He says he needs to speak with you about his graduation money. David had been expecting this visit. The $50,000 he'd given Tyler had been carefully structured as a loan, with terms that began 6 months after graduation. Today marked Tyler's first payment deadline. Send him up. Tyler appeared in David's doorway 5 minutes later, looking older and more worn than his 22 years suggested. He'd lost weight, and his clothes looked like they'd been purchased at discount stores rather than the high-end retailers David's money had previously afforded. Dad, about the loan agreement. Sit down, Tyler. The young man settled into the chair across from David's desk. the same chair where countless business negotiations had been conducted. But this wasn't a negotiation, it was a reckoning. "I can't make the payments," Tyler continued. "I've been working, but entry-level jobs don't pay enough to cover $5,000 a month plus living expenses." David had structured the loan specifically to be unpayable on an entry-level salary. It was designed to teach Tyler the value of the support he'd so casually discarded. "What did you do with the money?" "I used most of it for living expenses after graduation. I thought you'd help me get started with a job, maybe at your company." Tyler's voice carried a hint of the entitlement that had cost him his father's support. "I didn't expect to be completely on my own. You told me to block you forever. You excluded me from your graduation. You chose another man as your father figure." David's tone remained neutral. "Why would you expect help from someone you discarded?" Tyler's composure finally cracked. "Because you're my father. Because I was 21 and stupid and believed things that weren't true. You were 21 and old enough to make choices. Those choices have consequences." David opened a file on his desk. "You have two options. You can honor the loan agreement and make your payments, or you can declare bankruptcy and destroy your credit for the next 7 years." "Dad, please. I've learned my lesson. I understand what I did wrong." Understanding and experiencing consequences are different things. You need to learn both. David stood to indicate the meeting was over. "The loan terms are non-negotiable." "What about Mom? She needs help too. Your mother made her choices. She's experiencing the consequences of those choices, just like you are." Tyler stood slowly, the reality of his situation finally settling in. "You're really going to let your own family struggle while you live like this?" He gestured at the luxurious office, the view of the city, the visible symbols of David's success. "Tyler, I didn't create your struggles. I built this success through 22 years of 18-hour days, missed vacations, and sacrificed time with people I loved. You and your mother decided that sacrifice made me the villain in your story." David moved to the window, looking down at the construction site where his crew was breaking ground on the next project. "Now you're learning what life looks like without that sacrifice. So this is permanent. You'll never forgive us." David turned back to his son, seeing Rebecca's eyes and his own stubborn chin in the young man's face. The genetic connection remained, but the emotional bond had been severed by choices that couldn't be undone. "Tyler, forgiveness implies that someone has taken responsibility for their actions and made amends. You've apologized for being deceived by Brad, but you haven't acknowledged what you did to me independently of his influence. You haven't taken responsibility for excluding me from your graduation, for threatening to cut me off, for choosing to believe that your father was your enemy. I was wrong about all of that. Being wrong and taking responsibility are different things. Taking responsibility means accepting consequences, not just acknowledging mistakes." David returned to his desk. "When you're ready to take responsibility for your choices, all of them, we can have another conversation. Until then, the loan terms stand." Tyler left without another word. David watched from his window as his son emerged from the building and walked to a 15-year-old sedan that had clearly seen better days. The young man who'd once driven a BMW paid for by his father's labor was learning to navigate the world without that safety net. David felt no satisfaction in Tyler's struggles, but he felt no regret either. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and some boundaries, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. His phone buzzed with a text from Ray Morrison. "New project in Austin looking for a reliable contractor. Interested?" David smiled as he typed his response. Always interested in building something new. Outside his window, the city sprawled toward the horizon, a testament to what could be accomplished through determination, skill, and the refusal to accept betrayal. David Crane had built his empire one foundation at a time, and he would continue building, unencumbered by people who'd chosen to see his strength as weakness. The family he'd worked to support was gone, destroyed by their own choices and a predator who'd exploited their weaknesses. But David remained, as solid and unforgiving as the buildings that bore his name. In the end, that was enough. It would always be enough. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.